Roots, New Art on Stage.
Welcome to this podcast of the Art of Assembly, the 13th edition of the Art of Assembly with the title Designing Politics, Architectures of Deliberation and Decision Making. This podcast is based on a live event at Münchner Kammerspiele on March 9, 2022. My name is Florian Malzacher. I'm a curator, dramaturg and writer and hosting this series. My guests tonight are the architects and theorists Davi, Mulder van der Vegt and Markus Miessen, and very unfortunately not Gabo Heindl, who had to cancel just a few hours ago due to, obvious reasons that just show that the pandemic unfortunately is far from being over. This is, of course, really a shame, since Gabo's proposition for infrastructures of radical democratic participation would have been a very important argument tonight. But that's how it is. We will have to imagine them a little bit ourselves. The Art of Assembly is a series of lectures and conversations on the potential of human gatherings in art, activism, and politics. It is a nomadic series that started more than a year ago and took place in different cities and theaters, and unfortunately, again for known reasons, very often only online. So I'm very happy that this could be happening at the stage of Münchner Kammerspiele in front of a real audience. And if you are joining for the first time, I'd like to invite you to check out our website, art-of-assembly.net, where you find videos of all lectures so far and podcasts of the full episodes. You can also subscribe to newsletter if you want. So when we talk tonight about architectures of deliberation and decision making, this happens in front of a backdrop of quite powerful images, as you all know. So Putin on different huge tables or huge halls, putting a lot of distance between himself and others. Zelensky in an olive green shirt, very close deliberation with other, usually men, also in green shirts. Zelensky taking the Ukrainian people. Zelensky on a screen in front of the EU Parliament. Biden's State of the Union speech at the Congress and at the Capitol. Annalena Baerbock in front of the EU, etc., etc. You all know these images. And these are clearly images, and I think that's also telling for the situation we are in, not images of deliberation. These are images of declaring decisions or pleas to make certain decisions. And they are juxtaposed by other images of people fleeing, bombed houses, and so on. So the whole series, in a way, has been, since it started, in a paradoxical situation. From the very beginning on, January last year, we were talking about gatherings, of physical gatherings, of the importance of physical gatherings, and were not able to gather. So this absurd and sometimes a little bit ridiculous situation, I think, was also at the same time an opportunity to maybe take a bit of distance to these ideas or the concept of assembling, and maybe also longing for this and re-evaluating why we actually need to assemble for. Do we actually need physically to assemble for? Can we do everything on Zoom? So this juxtaposition was, I think, productive, even though it felt very awkward at times. And tonight, when we're here to talk about architectures of deliberation and decision making, I think it's a bit also a paradoxical moment again, as I said. So for the last 13 days, obviously, they have not been about deliberation, but about decision-making, leadership, even though these decisions were maybe sometimes a little bit forced from the outside. But it was about acting in a way, and of course, there are many good reasons for that. And it's interesting, in the course of the series, we were talking about it, because a lot of assemblies and activism are based on the concept of consensus. So there are a lot of deliberations, long deliberations, to come to a decision, because it has to be in consensus. But in the last episode, not referring to the current situation at all, just about other situations, Isabelle Fremont and Jay Jordan, two activists, very influential activists, kind of pointed out that there's also an end to consensus, and this is the moment when it comes to a fight. So even in these consensus-based groups, there's an end to it. So in a way, it seems a little bit we are in a moment of
there's no alternative again. And for me, most telling was most recently an action by artists in the Guggenheim Museum in New York, basically calling for an intervention of the NATO in Ukraine, which without judging it is quite an unusual step for artists in Guggenheim to call for when we look a couple of weeks back. So just looking at the situation, it seems we move away from a time where, because of the virus, parliaments and other deliberations were often not so much in power, and it was about decision-making. Now we again, for other reasons, and for good reasons, that's not the point, are in a situation where deliberation seems not to be in the focus. There seems not to be time for deliberation. And so I think maybe this is an opportunity, because we will not talk about this so much tonight, this is an opportunity to, again, to take a little bit a step back and deliberate a little bit about the necessity of deliberation and the architectures that can enable, or the spatial settings that could enable such deliberations. And for me, when I started thinking about this years, long time ago, it was actually I wanted to have an evening about architecture of parliaments. I thought, okay, this must be a very interesting field. There must be a lot of experimentation of different models of parliaments in the world, because so clearly that relates to how states are functioning, democracies or non-democracies, and so on. And then I kind of think, and David will show tonight in his presentation, I also, also through his book, I realized actually no, there are actually not so many experimentation in parliaments. Most of them have the same, I think it's 5 shapes that are repeated over and over again. And I was wondering also then what practical examples are, which architects are working on different parliaments. And again, it seems like there's not so much happening there, so you can correct me later. So my idea that this must be a very interesting field of architecture was maybe proven wrong. We can talk about it. And so we talked tonight about parliaments, but more broadly about architectures of deliberation and decision-making, and how they work as a visual image, as a metaphor for the kind of decision-making that is happening, but how they also might influence the kind of decisions that can be made. So what influence does a spatial setting actually have, or is it just architects saying there is an influence? So I'm very happy that Mulder van der Vegt is here, who has researched the design of the parliament halls of all 193 member states of the United Nations, and he reflects on the correspondence between their architecture and the type of political structure they represent. Markus Miessen proposes the concept of crossbenching as a practice of independent individuals acting without mandate and without having to respond to a presupposed set of protocols and consensual arrangements. And Gabu Heindl would have talked about infrastructures that can create room for radical democratic participation. So this is unfortunately a position we have to imagine ourselves a little bit tonight. David Mulder van der Vegt is an Amsterdam-based architect and writer. He is one of the founders of XML, an Office for Architecture, Urbanism and Research. In 2014, David was a finalist for the Prix de Rome. The work of XML has been exhibited internationally in architectural biennials like Venice, etc. And the main reason why David is here tonight is in 2016 he co-authored the book Parliament that, as I said, compares the plenary halls of all the parliaments in the United Nations. And I skip maybe most of it, but you're teaching and working on different projects. And between 2014 and 2016, you directed the interdisciplinary research program Designing Democracy at the Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam. And currently you are studio master at the Design Academy in Eindhoven.
Yes. Thank you, Florian. Also, thank you for inviting me to contribute to this remarkable series. I'm very happy that I'm able to contribute to this series because it's a topic, the whole idea of the architecture of assembly, but also the very notion of what it means to let's say, come together and to form a notion of collectivity is something that is very, let's say, is one of the continuing preoccupations in the work of our office. So, as From said, I'm an architect in Amsterdam. I'm together with a partner running an architecture office, XML. And we tend to talk about our approach to architecture as research-driven. And with that, what we mean is that for us, architecture is primarily a way of thinking that can materialize in different forms, most of the times through buildings or urban plans, but sometimes also not necessarily to things that people expect from architects, such as books or researches or exhibitions. And within this, let's say, part of our work, a reoccurring fascination is the architecture of particularly a political assembly or congregation. And maybe, like tonight we were asked to talk for 20 minutes, so I will focus on one project in particular, which is our research on parliaments. But for the last 12 years, we've, I think, explored this topic of the architecture of assembly in a range of projects, from exhibition and art installations to actual architecture. So maybe later in our conversation, I would also be happy if you're interested to also share a little bit more of the actual architecture project. But for now, I will focus on the analysis of parliaments first. Maybe as a kind of a small anecdote, like how we got interested in this topic, is that maybe 12 years ago, around 2010, by coincidence, I saw two fragments of a political discussion on television. One was happening here. This is the space or the plenary hall of the Dutch Parliament. And this is the plenary hall of the House of Commons in the UK. And I think if you sort of, let's say, have them next to each other, that everybody immediately sees from these images that the atmosphere in which debates takes place are completely different in both settings. And that made us realize that, let's say, the plenary hall of a parliament is on one hand, I think, a kind of an expression of a political culture or a representation of a political culture. So when people, are asked about images of their political system, they often also refer to the plenary hall. So it's a very important symbol of that political system. But at the same time, it also shapes that culture, as it is architecture that basically places the different actors within that political debate into a certain setting, and in that sense also organizes that culture. From that kind of hypothesis, by then we were teaching in Delft University of Technology, the Faculty of Architecture, and we did a small research project with students in which we designed new plenary halls for the Dutch Parliament. And after that we were kind of hooked. It became a much larger fascination that resulted in traveling the world, starting to document a whole series of different political assembly spaces. So this is an overview of the spaces that we visited. The color of the map basically shows the political regime in which these spaces were located. So we visited spaces in different political regimes from different times, but also from different skills or, let's say, their position within the political system. So from municipal councils to actual parliaments, but also supranational institutions like the United Nations. We documented these in terms of, let's say, what were the settings, but we also quite meticulously looked at the space itself, mainly through photography and applying, let's say, the toolkit of architecture, mainly drawing, making sections and plans, to better understand the settings of these spaces. So this is, for example, I think this is also being used for the sort of, let's say, poster of today, but this is the Italian Parliament. This is the Japanese Diet in Tokyo. This is the Câmara dos Deputados in Brasilia by Oscar Niemeyer, which is, again, let's say, kind of a different setting. This is a Kotla, which is a kind of more community council in Botswana. This is the Russian Duma, which we also visited. And maybe it's kind of a small sidestep, when we were visiting, very proud of all these iPads, because they said we're the first paperless parliament in the world, which immediately makes you wonder if it's basically not only sort of looking at the screens, but the screens also looking back at you, as everything you do in this parliament is meticulously tracked and traced and under surveillance. This is the parliament in Bangladesh, designed by Louis Kahn, the European Parliament. And I'm just showing you a series of these photos to also not only show the kind of parliament that we visited, but also to see, let's say, different type of settings. And that resulted in a publication that we like to refer to as a kind of a diptych, which is on one hand a digital publication on this website, and on the other hand, the book. And before I go to the book, the website is actually showing. So we went to these spaces, we documented through 360 photography, and it basically the website allows you to visit virtually these spaces. Because one of the paradoxes, I think, is that although this parliament or this kind of plenary hall is one of the most, let's say, important public places or spaces within society, it's often extremely difficult to have access to it or to be part of that space. And we thought that it would be interesting through this kind of documentation to also open up these spaces, allowing you to, let's say, visit them and to compare them. In parallel to that, we collected the floor plans of all the parliaments of the 193 member states of the United Nations, creating the book that is conveniently called Parliament. And it basically presents the parliaments all on the same, let's say, in the same way. So this is a spread from the book. So on the right hand, you see always the diagram of the parliament in the same scale, 1 to 400. And on the left hand, you see always the same type of data. So it's not only the name or the architect or the number of seats and so on, very sort of, let's say, simple data, but also a little bit more speculative. For example, how many people are represented by one seat, but also what is the, let's say, position of the country on the the Economist Democracy Index, allowing to speculate a little bit more on the relationship between the actual shape of the parliament and the, let's say, level of democracy in that country. This is China. So one of the things you see is that the larger the actual plenary hall, the most likely lower position of the country on this democracy index. And then the book also contains a series of indexes in which we group the different plenary halls and diagrams according to certain, let's say, lists. So the democracy index, also typologies. And I think that what for us was kind of interesting, and also Florian hinted at that already a little bit, is that although each of these 193 nations and parliaments think of themselves as a kind of unique expression of national identity, in fact there are only 5 shapes in which these parliaments convene. So one is the, and I will go through them one by one. So the first one is, and I guess Markus will also talk about this a little bit, is this opposing benches, which is the model that we started with tonight, the opposing benches of the House of Commons in the UK. And I think what is interesting is that although some people refer to this as the sort of, let's say, ultimate form of democratic debate, let's say, the architectural setting in itself is not necessarily democratic, as it kind of, let's say, goes back to a royal court in which basically a king consults its clergy and noblemen. And that setting hasn't changed. Of course, let's say, the organization of that parliament has changed, but the king has been exchanged for a speaker, which still sitting on the throne. And even here you see that the regalia of the parliament are sort of, let's say, in front of that throne to emphasize the power that is in the center of the space. And on both sides you have the 2 parties. A second, and this is the most common shape that parliaments, in which parliaments meet, which is the semicircle. And when after, let's say, the beginning of the 19th century, most European parliaments were formed, it was also the time of neoclassicism, and a lot of these parliaments were built in a kind of semicircular setting, kind of theatrical setting, also symbolically referring back to the symbol of the Greek direct democracy, which is the Greek theater. And I think if you start to look more closely at this typology, what I think is super important in the Greek theater is that the actual semicircle not only organizes, let's say, the gaze of the people on of the audience towards the stage, but also towards each other. So effectively, actually, the architecture is also creating a kind of, let's say, public body that together discusses the topics that are sort of like at stake within that city-state. But it's also a shape that is open to the territory over which it's actually taking decisions. And in that sense, I think that the reference to the Greek city-state is not accurate, because it's not so necessarily it's a Greek theater, it's a Roman theater in which its connection to the outside world is actually interfered by, let's say, the backdrop. And here again, the picture of the l'Assemblée Nationale, which is not a Greek theater, but a Roman theater, in which the outside world is somewhere else. And it's actually a representative elite that is taking decisions within this world that is hardly connected to what's happening outside. And in that sense, obviously the spaces have been populated with all kind of technology and cameras over time, making it effectively into a kind of TV studio. And I think the European Parliament in Strasbourg is, with all good intentions, but an extreme example of that, in which the whole, let's say, space is so designed that every member of Parliament is actually sort of, let's say, in the right light for television. And one could even argue, we can even wonder, sort of course, this is Strasbourg, and there's a whole reason why it's in Strasbourg, but probably this could have been also done on Frankfurt Airport, and maybe it was more effective to have it there. And I think, so if you go, let's say, through this sequence, so this is the Greek theater, then basically the territory disappears. And then in a way, maybe this is how we relate to Parliament now, in which basically also our media channels are sort of like very much mediating how we relate to politics, almost, let's say, making architecture disappear. A third typology that we identified is kind of a hybrid of the previous two. So it's this kind of opposing benches that on one side bend toward each other, which we call the horseshoe. And this is a shape that we mostly see in former Commonwealth or actual Commonwealth countries. A fourth one is the circle. And that's, there are only 9 parliaments in the world that have a circular shape. I show you what I think still is one of the most beautiful parliaments, which is the West German parliament designed by Günter Behnisch in the 80s, which was hardly used because after it was delivered, the parliament, as you know, moved to Berlin, and now it's a Congress center. But I think this is one of the, or maybe, it's one of the few examples of an architect that truly tried to make a democratic space in a kind of modern architectural language. And I think what is in that sense also interesting here is how the building makes this connection to the outside world and also to the Rhine River where it is located. And the last typology is what we called this classroom, in which all members of parliament are sitting behind each other, or a little bit like this, with one mostly white guy talking. And everybody sort of, let's say, is facing that speaker. And most non-democratic regimes are using this kind of typology for their parliament. So this is the China's People's Congress or the North Korean People's Congress. And what kind of surprises is that if you look at, let's say, the origin of these shapes, is that most of these parliaments were actually built in the 19th century. And also these typologies basically derive from the 19th century. And these parliaments haven't changed after that. So still parliaments all meet in kind of settings from the 19th century, also responding to a world that is completely, that has completely changed. So I started this talk with this picture, which I think for me is a very inspiring picture. These are the Hong Kong protests from 2015. But it actually shows sort of, let's say, I think also the need and the sort of, let's say, crisis of that we need to invent, let's say, new forms of what it means to sort of, let's say, be together and to form a kind of collectivity or a new architecture of assembly. Not necessarily to, I don't think that architecture in that sense can basically solve the sort of, let's say, crisis of democracy or the, let's say, the question of, let's say, the decreasing confidence in democracy. But I think architecture, as it is basically a tool that shapes the world that we inhabit, can actually be an interesting experiment to develop new modes of what it means to be together and to come together. How many minutes do I have left? Yeah, okay, then I want to show one project, because architects always want to talk about projects. And this is a project that we did for the European Council in Brussels. This is the Justus Lipsius building, and it's actually the building where the European Council of Government Leaders meet. So this is actually the old building, so this is a project from 2016. In the meantime, they have constructed a new building next door. Well, the white building that has been demolished, and there's a new building, but we did this project in the old building. And it's like an incredible European fortress. So when you see these images of government leaders that enter a building to discuss yet another European crisis, it used to be always here. In this building, let's say the European Council meets, and the presidency of the Council basically changed twice a year. And it was tradition that the presiding country was to create a meeting room for government leaders. So when the Netherlands was the president of the European Council in 2016, we got the commission to design that space. And first we looked at how other countries, what was the kind of, let's say, way other countries did that. And we found out that basically it was always the same formula. So it was design furniture from country plus flag. So you see on the upper left, you see Slovenia with Slovenian flag, and then Belgium design, Belgian flag, Greek design, Greek flag, and obviously Danish design, Danish flag. So and kind of the paradox of that is that through this kind of consecutive celebration of national identity, sort of like the whole idea of a kind of a European identity or European language kind of, let's say, remains out of sight. So we wanted to do a kind of European project, but also a project in which, let's say, the stable political setting of these large chairs where, let's say, positions are fixed and architecture is very much literally also a power structure, is kind of destabilized. So we took the two dominant typologies for political meeting spaces in Europe that I just presented, the opposing benches from the UK, that was by then still a member of the European Union, and the semicircle, creating effectively a kind of meeting landscape. So it became this kind of huge object in which it was not so evident where to sit, where to position oneself, but it was also a space that allows for a different kind of setting. So in a way, the space and the architecture becomes also a kind of an agent or becomes part of the debate as it kind of, let's say, provokes to think about the type of exchange that you're about to have in the space. It was too big to fit in the room, so we And we also liked this idea of a space that basically breaks the room, and that kind of, let's say, is sort of, like that sense, also beyond the kind of walls. Yeah, this is the model. And then, because it was too big, we had to make it in smaller pieces. So we decided to make 28 of them for each of the 28 member states. And then together, sort of, let's say, they constitute this, this larger sort of rock formation onto which government leaders could sit or lay down or sort of, let's say, confront each other or just sort of, let's say, cuddle up. Creating a completely different kind of political meeting space, yet still having this kind of, let's say, flag, but we're at least able to put it outside. Okay, I'm going to finish with that. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'm, of course, very curious to hear in our conversation if it was ever used by the state leaders and if somebody was lying on there or if they preferred to bring their own chairs. Thanks a lot. And now I'm happy that Markus Miessen is here. Markus is an architect, writer, director of Studio Miessen and professor at the University of Luxembourg, where he holds the chair of urban regeneration. He received his PhD from Center of Research Architecture at Goldsmiths, London, and his work revolves around questions of critical spatial practice, institution building, and spatial politics. You have taught at many places, where I've been a Harvard Fellow and had the Stiftungsprofessur for critical spatial practice at Städelschule. And amongst many other books and writings, Markus is the author of The Nightmare of Participation. Already the title was, of course, interesting for us with this series and became used a lot. I think the title is actually made its way into a lot of discussions. And crossbenching toward participation as critical spatial practice. And together with Nicholas Hirsch, he's the editor of the Critical Spatial Practice book series.
Good evening, nice to meet you all. Thank you so much for the invitation, Florian, and the Kammerspiele. Maybe just to connect to one of the things that you just mentioned, which was the book that I did in 2010 called The Nightmare of Participation. This was actually, in a way, the starting point for, let's say, a larger research trajectory that then started to look into both alternative modes of participation on the one hand, but also, spatially speaking, different questions around assembly and how this can be kind of proactively used also in design terms. And crossbenching was then, in a way to deal with the question of how participation can also produce a kind of inverted scenario in which then something like cultures of assembly could become actually something proactive. So what I will be talking about today is not my design work, but rather a set of questions around assembly and questions around crossbenching. And the way that I'm going to do this is through one research project that I did together with Joseph Grima in Kuwait in 2010 also, which was called Diwania. So what you see here, to most of you probably looks like a traditional tea house or cafe. Maybe it's slightly different from a kind of normative setting because it's only populated, or at least it seems like it's only populated by men. But otherwise it looks fairly, let's say, normal. There's some kind of medical looking device, which is in fact a PlayStation. There's some people smoking. But it actually, in social and socio-political terms, fulfills exactly the same function as this room. And these rooms in Kuwait are called Diwania, and it's a very interesting distributed typology that exists around 4,000 times in Kuwait City. And it's basically a form of localized decision-making, which exists always in design terms in the same kind of type, which is essentially a room with a hollow core, so there's nothing in the center of the space. and a set of benches that are populating the perimeter of the space. And so any of these spaces which really exist in very different kind of settings, so this, for example, is the outside version of this one, which belongs to the same family, but the same one, for example, in terms of a kind of urban type, would also exist in a refugee camp on the outskirts of the city. So it's essentially a kind of distributed form of democratic becoming, which of course at first sounds, and that's also where it needs to be understood as an analogy, at least to some extent, because of course we're talking about Kuwait, and of course in Kuwait there's also an emir, so this, we're not talking, I mean, I don't know exactly where this sits on your democracy index, but we're not talking about the, let's say, upper echelon, so to speak. But it's interesting, I think, because it basically produces a form of distributed assembly that then starts to inform the official decision-making bodies. And so you have to imagine this as essentially a box that's being, so this one, for example, being the Diwania of the Fishermen's Union. These are always boxes, let's say like this one, which are attached to usually a family house, so private house, and which are run by that specific family, and there tend to be several of these spaces in a residential street. And so you could compare it, let's say, in Western terms to the 19th century pub, so the public room or the public house, which was essentially a space where in working class neighborhoods you would create a kind of local living room in which also, again, at this time, mostly men would meet. There's also a very interesting side story talking about the male-female divide in Kuwait, that actually it was through Diwania or through these particular settings that women actually forced their way into parliament, so they started to lobby for democratic representation in these spaces. And then, of course, you also get the kind of extremely crude version of this, or the very basic version, which is the one which happens at the street corner. And so the important fact is that in all these spaces, there's a kind of trickle-up information procedure where the materials, the knowledge, the course of the discussion is always being trickled up to the next kind of representative of the parliament, who's actually overlooking that specific area in which the Diwania takes place. So we produced a two-channel video about this, which was part of a larger documentary project, which I think Florian mentioned already. We were doing as a residency at Harvard Graduate School of Design, which then also had a set of other outputs, like a set of printed matter documents that looked into the question of consensus when it comes to these specific spaces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you short text, and then I'm going to take you through a set of, let's say, questions or provocations that I think could be helpful for the debate in terms of thinking about how design can actually play a role in these questions. Today, we need to be aware that the discursive rendering of the concept of so-called public space is often no more than a nostalgic veneer. This is not to say that public space conceptually is something that is not worth defending, but rather that public space as a term and practice needs to be redefined in the overall framework of the contemporary condition. Today, we're facing a situation in which it would be naive to talk about the public. As a political imaginary, the public is mostly a projected ideal, an idealized longing for a somewhat homogeneous entity which is factually inexistent. Today we have to redefine the one-to-one scale of urban social life. Publics, a heterogeneous landscape composed of a plethora of multi-scaled actors, stakeholders, and constituencies who together form a reality which generate the so-called public sphere. Publics as a term moves away from public space as a spatial typology towards an understanding of a space for public situations, a space as an enabler for heterogeneous social groups and programs, a space full of gray zones and conflicts where friction becomes a translator of social desires. The construction of publics is dealing with a discursive reality around the creation of physical assembly, be it formal or informal, temporary, permanent, or unstable. So here are my 12 thoughts. 1. Alienation. Is it possible to transplant debate into situations which by default create a setting that fosters spatial and therefore social friction in order to generate productive debate? 2. Decentralization. Is it possible to introduce localized micro-parliaments that foster extended neighborhood debates in order for them to be trickled up the formal political ladder as a democracy of scales? 3. Resources. How would such physical setting be constituted with less economic means but retain the same political influence? 4. Orientation. Is it possible to insert consensual outsiders into situations which are primarily governed by pre-consensual status quo? 5. Choreography. Is it possible to generate a physical object that by scale and location produces a contemporary datum for consensual debate, one which allows for programmatic and physical standoff between different political camps? And I'm sure we'll talk about this one later. 6. Proximity. Is it possible to generate situations of presence that foster transparency while exacerbating political debate? 7. Friction. Any spatial situation is driven by underlying conflicts. Those can be designed or happen spontaneously. In any case, they will always alter the narrative of the situation. 8. Institution. Any hardware requires a software. How can one consider the structural and institutional components that play an integral role in terms of how public architecture can perform? When do the opening hours become programmatic? 9. Support structure. What constitutes the bare physical minimum in order to create a public situation from which to generate debate? 10. Camp. How can one consider physical and non-physical forms and formats of design that together form a hybrid typology as a direct response to both spatial and organizational needs? 11. Enablers. How can a specific physical scale be merged with a series of uneasy triggers in order to generate deliberate zones of conversational and performative friction? 12. Pandemic. Since the beginning of the lockdowns, no one has the answers. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Well, a lot of questions, and of course, that's maybe one of the interesting points we can talk about. How between these questions or this analysis that you did, David, what comes out of it, and how architecture actually navigates for me as a non-architecture person, and also just glancing at, I often see this need for pragmatics in a way. And then concepts that are really far-reaching, and the space in between, obviously, is a complicated thing. No, but maybe to start with a question that is probably, well, not easy to answer, but to stay with the pragmatics in a way, with both of your analyses. If you would be to design a parliament, So what would be your attempt, like, for example, Germany needs a new parliament. Does it make sense at all to think about it? Because anyway, everything is set and then you build whatever and it doesn't make a difference? Or would it be a way to influence the situation already, like very pragmatically maybe, to say, okay, the German parliament looks different and that would change something? Or is that a very naive or too naive question?
Okay, maybe I can start actually also referring to what you've shown. I think it was very interesting that you actually also showed the version in Bonn, so to speak, the West German parliament before reunification. I think there's a common issue, let's say, with architects, that when they talk, because you said, are they also thinking really about designing parliaments? I mean, of course, they're designing parliaments. So each parliament that we've looked at in your study, for example, has been designed by an architect. I would think it's a little bit problematic that usually what's being designed is the hard shell of the building and not necessarily the questions around actual assembly or the questions around how then the software, so to speak, actually starts to inform the decision-making that's taking place there. So for me personally, I think what would be interesting would be to think about what that software could entail and how maybe it, rather than it being a kind of singular situation, it would maybe be a kind of multiple. So this is one thing that, for example, I definitely learned from Kuwait, that this form of distributed assembly as a form of information producer, so to speak, for the official parliament to also feel kind of connected to other forms of local assemblies. This is something super interesting. I think there could also be other ways. I mean, recently we talked about it before. I mean, there have been lots of ideas around lottery-based assemblies, which could be interesting maybe once they're connected to, let's say, professional commissions, so that there's still kind of like expert knowledge, not in the room, but in the house or nearby, but it's, the decision-making is actually taking place. They're being informed, but the decision-making is taking place by non-experts. So this sounds maybe interesting or not interesting. It probably doesn't sound very architectural, but I think these processes need to be designed. Yeah.
I agree, because in a way I think it is also very much about, well, to, let's say, stay with the terms software and hardware. In that sense, the software, let's say in architectural terms, is also a bit of the program. So, meanings, basically, what are you about to design, for what are you about to design? And I think if you ask the question, and because of the book, this question has been asked many times, what is the best parliament? And I think, to me, the answer would be a parliament that is able to change, you know, and particularly also a plenary hall that is able to change, and that is able to accommodate different settings. And because I think in this kind of, let's say, instability and in this kind of transformation, indeed, sort of, let's say, also experiments can take place for different forms of assembly, opening up, I would say, this kind of center of the debate to, let's say, different kind of configurations. And maybe an interesting anecdote in this respect about, let's say, the parliament also as a sort of, let's say, guarding the status quo, is that, well, because of the book, I'm sometimes sort of like asked also to present the research to parliaments that are at the point of transformation. So at one point I was invited to talk on a conference where a number of project leaders of parliaments that were at the moment of transformation in the world were coming together. These parliaments were all established more or less around the same time, so they also go through the same renovation cycle. So there are always more or less 10 or 15 parliaments in the world that more or less sort of like about to renovate around the same time. And then, because of this renovation, parliaments need to leave their plenary hall, and most of the time they need to find a temporary place where they meet while their actual space is being renovated. So I was very enthusiastic and sort of like also suggesting, well, this is the perfect cover to experiment with other forms, right? So if these 5 topologies are all from the 19th century, this is your chance to do something different. And then, interestingly enough, these bureaucrats, they were all like super enthusiastic, so they were really like, yeah, this is what we really want to do. But the politicians don't want it. And I think it's on one hand, kind of like it proves a little bit the point of the book, or the argument of the book, that this architecture is also very much kind of, let's say, a power structure or political structure. But it also shows maybe that the change indeed doesn't need to come from inside, but from outside, right? And that we, in that sense, and I agree with you, Markus, that we need to kind of, let's say, develop also, like strategies in which the actual software of politics is transformed in order to also transform the architecture. At the same time, I also think that architecture sort of can provoke that change.
That's interesting. So in a way, you have to not only develop the building, you also have to renovate democracy or the system it's in, and it would be vice versa, which of course makes sense. And we probably have to, and again, it's a pity also that Gabo is not here to think more on a small scale, local level, I think, to a degree, or like Jonas Dahl, who was an artist who was also in the series a couple of editions ago. They created a parliament, well, not for the state, but like a communal parliament in Rojava for the Kurdish population there as an open space. The idea of temporality or things that can change is of course interesting. Actually, we had a couple of editions ago, we had, when Benjamin from Raumlabor was there, we were talking about architectures of hospitality, and actually also ended up with that the temporarity, the possibility to change and be flexible is in the key of it. That kind of contradicts the symbolic nature that the parliament also has. Then if the German parliament every day looks different, I mean every year looks different, even there might be another desire confronting that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also maybe one thing that we have to distinguish, whether it's a parliament that's deliberately designed so that it's a symbolic / representational space, and or a space which is also understood as a space to work in inverted commas, so where to have kind of genuine debate. And I think, I mean, you showed the House of Commons, for example. I think this is a really interesting example of a space which is of course also very representational, but on the other hand, through its basically spatial design, also sets a kind of backdrop for, and through its choreography, a certain backdrop for a different kind of debate than, for example, in the German parliament, which is of course very much like a situation in here where there's some people standing in the front and some people listening. And I mean, of course, you've showed the one in Bonn, which was very, I mean, not so different from the one in Berlin, but much more, let's say, open in terms of this kind of culture of conversation. But I think the one in London is, and both, I mean, the House of Commons and the House of Lords are both quite interesting. Not necessarily in terms of what they may represent politically, but in its design language.
But also, also in terms of, let's say, how the architecture indeed provokes a certain culture. So there's the whole idea of I mean, for example, this British phenomenon of the shadow government, right? That is literally facing the actual government on the other side of the room, sort of like, sorry, in every debate you're immediately having someone facing you in every sort of, let's say, presence, kind of like resonating that he knows better. I think that is something that the architecture kind of almost provokes, that this kind of political elements, and it's kind of unthinkable, or not, but it's not very, it is not as powerful to do that kind of thing in a semicircular setting, for example. Yeah.
I mean, which is another point, of course, and it's also clear in your book, and that in a way the parliaments are also, since we are speaking in the theater, the parliaments are theaters also. Huh? So you go out and you perform, and you're even more, maybe even more today than 100 years ago, because everything is televised and so on. So it's clear, and I think in your book you mentioned that there are more and more rooms added for other kind of deliberations. So the deliberations are happening everywhere, but not necessarily in the main parliament. Now there are also virtual rooms, maybe that's also something to talk about. So you go out and you perform a certain kind of deliberation, a certain kind of decision making, maybe more than you're doing it. Any kind of deliberation brings some performance with it. You want to convince people and discuss, but the amount of it is probably different from the spaces you were showing Kuwait, where I guess usually there are no cameras and you're amongst each other and you already know, okay, this guy is speaking like this and so on. So these rituals, this ritualized kind of deliberation might change. So when we go on a communal level, on a small level, let's say, and try to put some of this idea in place. So not in a huge place, but so it would be easier to really shift things around and develop things spatially and procedure-wise at the same moment. Wouldn't that lead to something that you, if I understand it right, also criticize in your criticism of a certain kind of participation, that it puts a lot of work and pressure of everybody to participate in this and be part of it. So is there actually how to create also the desire to be part of it and not feeling forced, like, okay, now I worked all day and now I also have to have an opinion about this. So what is the nightmare of participation?
Yeah, I think the super interesting part about the Kuwaiti example is that it's a system where it's something that happens very informally, and it happens because you want to do it. So it's literally like meeting up with your friends in a kind of local space to discuss, but there's a kind of, let's say, other form of conversation that takes place that takes certain issues to the next level. It's certainly not a kind of participation that's being, let's say, enforced top-down. And my understanding would also be that it's not a participation where you ask people deliberately to become part of something, but where it's a choice that can be made by anyone who wants to be part of it. But it's also a form of, let's say, information giving rather than decision making. I think this is the really important difference, because otherwise you can also become, and this is in a way what the nightmare of participation is about, that you can also become a slave of that system, that you become a slave of decisions that are being made also by partially uninformed groups or individuals, which can of course also be dangerous. But it's not a general, let's say, trying to move away from, let's say, the historic or the, let's say, 60s and 70s idea or notion of participation, but it's to basically think about what could be kind of an extra layer that could be put on top of this.
Which of course is a big question, but I remember that we were discussing it at this other meeting around architecture. That for me, one question was when I looked at models now, at proposal for parliaments with my very limited scope, so I basically Googled a lot. And another experience I made when I was in Venice at the architectural biennial now, that I had the strong feeling, and when I talk to people, they kind of tend to agree with this, that I was a bit shocked by the lack of whatever cliche word to use, utopian vision, maybe. So it's like in Venice, where it was supposed to deal with the future and so on, and then the most visionary or utopian design I found in the whole exhibition was one from the 60s, basically next to the Whole Earth magazine and these things. So this was even more obvious because it was supposed to imagine maybe also a different kind of future. And also with parliaments, I understand the pragmatics, so let's not talk about the concrete commission to build whatever the Reichstag not new, but to say like, as an exercise, to think of completely different models, that it seems to be very difficult to imagine a different future in architecture. Is that true, or is it my very outside polemic impression?
I mean, I think it's true to a certain extent. I think there's, let's say, within the professional field of architecture, there's a definite interest in building, and of course also in speculation. But I think, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think when we talk about parliaments, I think the interest of most architects would probably be to design the building, and spend probably most time thinking about what this building would entail, let's say, as an architectural type, what it would entail in urban terms, and how it would, for example, contextualize within the urban fabric, but maybe not so much in terms of the software, as we discussed before. And I think, talking about it, let's say, I don't know if utopian would be the right word, but some kind of, let's say, speculative vision, from my point of view at least, this would always have to focus on the latter rather than the former. So, because a building, at the end of the day, I mean, it's also a system, of course, but it's a facade. And I think this will not really change the kind of inner system of political decision making. And talking about, you before mentioned the kind of visual and the virtual reality right now. And for example, now we're constantly, in Zoom meetings and in breakout rooms. I think this is quite interesting, because the notion of the breakout room and the notion of the informal when it comes to political decision making is extremely important. So the fact that you can also go outside and stand in the corridor, the fact that you have these kind of micro conversations where sometimes the actual decisions are actually being made rather than in the formal parliamentary space. There was actually, I don't know if you remember this one, I don't know exactly when this was, the OMA did a design for UN headquarters, I think, or like a redesign or something, which was essentially this kind of looked like an asterisk, which was basically these like long corridor buildings.
No, but I think it's not the UN, it was the NATO, I think, in
NATO.
Brussels.
Okay, maybe.
Yeah, that was a kind of an asterisk, around 2000 or so. Yeah.
So this was very interesting, because the polemic there was basically that you design the entire building like a set of, in plan view, it's kind of like an asterisk. So it's like very long corridors. And the rhetoric or the polemic was that the corridors are more important for decision making than the actual hall. So.
But I also, like to ask you, like, let's say about the lack of utopian vision in architecture. I think, we refer to that, I think a little bit already, is that architects work for clients to a certain extent. So this relationship towards the clientship is kind of like a very important element of the whole practice of architecture. And that I think in that sense also distinguish architecture fundamentally from art, for example. And I think in that sense the question is not only directed to architecture, but I would say also to the client and to this whole idea, who is it architects work for? So there is an element that I think obviously we work in the market economy, but I think and that this whole idea of what it means to be a public client and to reinvent the whole notion as the public as sort of, let's say, the driver for architecture. I think that is, in my opinion, basically the realm in which this question needs to be discussed. Right, so if architecture is a tool to imagine a sort of, let's say, collective future, then it's not necessarily, architecture is one of the ways to explore that future, but I think it's a larger discussion in which we also, let's say, as a collective or as an assembly, have to discuss that future, the kind of future we want, and then I think architecture is one of the ways to basically make that future visible.
And I guess, one problem of my provocation or my critique might be also that, of course, this idea of a utopian architectural design, which in the case of a democratic project would have to be a democratic design, maybe, and these designs, of course, often are based on the idea of a single architect, of a signature, of a bit Ayn Rand kind of modernist idea of the architecture. It really changes something, and that would be, I guess, the question, like how can this utopian vision be developed actually in a different way, even not by one architect having the great idea how to draw it, but how to develop, how to actually already have a deliberation or a parliament to only create the parliament would be the first question. What is the setup? What is the software of not only to propose there, but to come up with this software in a way?
Yeah, okay, but so this is really interesting, because I think there we're right in the center of the nightmare of participation. So there, my question, for example, would be, so then you think that the only democratic way to set this up would be if actually everyone was, or not everyone, but a more opened up system of decision making would be put into place?
I don't know if everybody would have to do it, but one of the questions also, like one question of in representation in theater is, of course, very much like, can an apparatus, which is still basically hierarchic, there's a lot of intervening now and trying to do things differently also in this house, but that has a certain structure, a modernist structure, an institution coming, as we know, from 18th century and so on. So can it actually change something? What does this representation on stage mean? It's a question basically coming from Vegt till today. So can you represent something and not doing it? So of course this is putting you to a degree also in another trap, but still I think it's a relevant question. I don't know who would be co-designing it, but the idea that for hoping that one person would come up with a radical new concept, especially when it's also about the software, which in a way means the democratic procedure. So somebody comes up with a democratic system by probably more him than herself, but whatever seems contradictory. And on the other hand, I agree with you that just saying, okay, everybody participates and then we see what comes out of it might also not be the way. But I think this kind of negotiation, and for me it seems that architectural companies, so maybe it's not only the clients, but architectural companies are also still often driven, I mean, at least the master architects, by a very hierarchical and system of thinking, and which can be productive, but maybe maybe comes also, I don't think it's the whole answer, but maybe it's part of the problem of a certain speculative thinking in this regard.
I mean, I think the answer would probably lie somewhere in the middle, so that, for me at least, I think it would have to be a process that's really widely informed by different constituencies and publics, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be involved in the design process, but rather that the design process is being informed in a much more substantial and complex way than before. And that's clear, I think, yes.
We can also maybe try to be a bit more inclusive here, and maybe could we have a little bit more light in the audience space also? That might make it easier. If you have comments or questions, it would be great to use the microphone so the people on the live stream can also hear you. I know that makes it even a bit more formal, and I know it's not the most easy situation to speak, but it would be nice if you did.
That's a software question. But by analyzing all the parliaments on this earth, did you ever meet a system changing who sits where? Because when Germany now got a new government, they were discussing who wants or does not want to sit next to the AfD, the right-wing party. And why wouldn't it be nice to just shuffle it 4 times a year? Because we are all living in a country, and we have to work together even if we hate our neighbor or whatever. Did you ever stumble across something like that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Also, thank you for the suggestion. I think it's a great suggestion to indeed reshuffle it. It's always like a very hot topic at the beginning of each parliamentary cycle, who's about to sit where. And mostly, indeed, parliaments, particularly semicircles, are organized, from left to right, so also following the political spectrum from left to right. It's, I think, a great example in Sweden, in which members of parliament are not seated based on their political color, but on their, let's say, geographical location. So it's where they come from. And that's also how they're seated in parliament. So if I'm well informed, I hope there are no Swedish people in the audience, or maybe they are and they can assist me here. But I think that Stockholm is sitting all the way to the front, and then the smallest, let's say, council, it's from the north is sitting all the way to the back. So everybody is sitting through each other, and you can also speculate a little bit about, let's say, the kind of, culture that produces that, right? So that maybe if the AfD would sit all the way through the whole Bundestag, it would perhaps also, create a different kind of, let's say, on a very personal level, a different kind of relationship between all these members of parliament, resulting in who knows what, right? So, but there are indeed examples of different forms of configuration, but they're rare. Mostly it's indeed this kind of, let's say, political coloring that follows the organization of the space.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question, because precisely this dispersing of the different voices could be very interesting also in terms of what kind of conversation this produces, but also how, for example, some of the more radical, speaking about, for example, the AfD, I think this would be interesting to see what would happen if they, as a kind of group of, I don't know how many people, let's say 30 people, would actually be dispersed over the entire space of the parliament, I think they would, of course, lose some of their voice, literally. I mean, like if you remember when you were, I don't know, in high school and the teacher would actually start to dislocate, so to speak, certain people and put them somewhere else. I think this is a very interesting approach. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, I mean, like, because you're bringing up high school, that in many of the parliaments I had to think about high school in the sense of that, you know, like, so there are about 200 to 300 people in this, let's say, ecology altogether, in this kind of bubble, in a very intense kind of, let's say, environment, all in the same building. Everybody knows each other. So there are many, let's say, elements on this kind of very interpersonal level that play a very important role in, let's say, how this political culture is formed that are mostly hidden. Right? So indeed, sort of just sitting next to each other, for example, just go out and bring a coffee for your neighbor, you know, which is a very almost mundane thing to do when you work in an office. You know, like obviously that also happens in the parliament, but these are little moments of exchange that, you know, have also political consequences.
I like the...
Maybe just to quickly add one thing, because now, of course, also in the German parliament, I mean, it keeps on growing, which is actually really a problem in terms of like hiding, because this personal relationship keeps on diminishing. I mean, if, for example, you compare it to, I don't know, the House of Commons, where it's, of course, also quite large, but very kind of confrontational and direct. I think in a space like the Bundestag, it's much more easy to somehow withdraw, and which also then means, of course, you withdraw from a certain political exchange and conversation.
But the House of Commons, you're talking about size, which is like really an architectural category, is that when during the war it was bombed or destroyed, there was discussion to maybe change it to this kind of semicircular setting. And then it was decided to build it back in exactly the same shape, although the amount or the number of members was actually growing. So basically it's a space that on important debates, when all 650 members are there, not everybody fits. And so that's kind of a deliberate choice also in how the space, sort of like when everybody wants to be there, immediately is too cramped, creates a kind of a very intense setting, you know, because you're literally cheek to cheek, you know, you're feeling the bodies of your other members sort of like pushing against yours. So it's far from comfortable when these important debates are taking place, also creating a kind of an atmosphere that is forced upon you by the architecture.
I like the idea of the president of the parliament, if you misbehave, sitting you somewhere else. Actually, it happened with the AfD because they had to sit on the balconies because they were not vaccinated. So in a way, it already happened. There was another question over there.
I mean, it's clear that a parliament is very similar to a theater, in fact, because in both terms, it's one person trying to talk to 300 to 700 people. And so you need acoustic and sight, etc. So I would rather ask you, because I think the more important thing is to talk not how can I talk to 300 to 700 people. The more important question would be how can I work with 300 to 700 people? So what also Markus said about the kind of informal spaces in the corridors and in this a Kuwaiti thing, but it could be formal. It doesn't have to be informal. I mean, how do they work? Because in the parliament, they actually only tell the result. And then there may be a discussion, but actually it's a theater. Because they work together in small groups and they maybe even like each other. But in the parliament, they hate each other because it's a theater. So for democracy reasons, I mean, to be real and not to be actors, how could it be? What spaces could you kind of offer, or what are existing spaces? How we could work together with the 300 to 700 people?
Yeah, I think this is a super interesting point, because I think what it points at is that not only the parliaments should be redesigned, but also the commissions, or the spaces in which the actual work is taking place. So it's kind of like a kind of geosystem of different, let's say, spatial configurations that work together as a network. So one is, let's say, a representational chamber, then there's the typical, let's say, work chambers or commissions. And then there's these kind of in-between spaces which also can become extremely important for these informal exchanges. But you're absolutely right. I mean, most parliaments, yes, they are theaters, and they are mostly representational rather than, I mean, even the debates that are taking place, they are heavily scripted. So,
yeah, and I think that's, for me at least, that's the issue with these plenary halls, is that because of this kind of, let's say, large ecology of spaces and in which the actual work, or in which the, let's say, those are also theatrical spaces, in the sense that often the debate can be theatrical, but there it's mostly hidden, right? People don't see what's happening there. So the theater that is performed in the plenary, there's nothing at stake anymore, because that happened already elsewhere. And it's also limited mostly to the ritual of sort of, let's say, acknowledging what has been decided. And in that sense, you also feel that there's nothing at stake anymore when you watch it. So either it's empty, or there are 12 people that are representing the different parties, but, you know, like their colleagues are, you know, having meeting elsewhere. So it's kind of very unclear in that sense also to have a focus of the democratic debate. And where the actual politics are being performed, you know, you have to be very informed in order to know, you know, what's happening where. And I think there, if you talk about the architecture of parliaments, I think there is also like really sort of like something that architecture can work on, you know, like to see how somehow you can connect that kind of, let's say, inner mechanism of power to the outside world, and to make that one way or the other more transparent.
I have a very pragmatic question. With all your experience with parliaments, is there any parliamentary system that allows other kind of neglected forms in democracy to invade the parliamentary discourse? Like saying, for example, we're talking a lot about cohabitation and nature and non-human life existing forms that need a voice. Is there protocols for parliamentary spaces where these forms can invade, and that also comes to, because you said the ecology of of the parliaments. From all the images that you showed, there was only the ones in Kuwait where you could see fresh air and so natural air and natural light being a part. Is there parliaments, except maybe for the not used West German parliament that at least had a window, parliaments that let kind of these kind of natural entities like air and light invade, and that way maybe also lead to more climate-friendly decision-taking, or is that no subject?
I think that in general, like these parliaments, that's also why I expanded so long about sort of the semicircle, which is not an open Greek theater, but in fact a sort of Roman theater disconnected from the world outside. Most plenary halls tend to be inside and indeed disconnected. It's also very difficult to locate them when you look at these parliament buildings from the outside. So that's definitely something. I'm sure that in some countries on the African continent, I can imagine for kind of, let's say, climate reasons that they are more open, but I cannot immediately mention one. I thought when you were starting your question that you were about to also refer to this kind of Latour experiment with this Parliament of Things, right? And then I know that I think in New Zealand now they're also experimenting with indeed giving nature or rivers, for example, also representation in Parliament. But if we really talk about, let's say, the physical structure, so let's say then, you know, for the sake of this conversation, the hardware, then mostly these parliaments are indeed disconnected. And there is also, I think, a kind of a school or a kind of, let's say, paradigm in which the argument is that it's important that there is no natural light, or let's say that the outside world is kind of, let's say, out of sight, so that the conditions in which things are being discussed are as neutral as possible. Right, so there is this argument saying like, okay, yeah, you create kind of almost a laboratory, so the conditions for the debate are always the same. So it's actually only the exchange of arguments, or it's only the discussion itself that decides, and it's not sort of like if it's nice blue weather and everybody's in a good mood, or if it's pouring rain, you know. So that there is a certain sort of, let's say, school that kind of, let's say, argues that way. I mean, like, you have, in that sense, I think the cupola, for all its sometimes problematic historical references, but I think that the fact that the German parliament is open to above, but particularly that you can also be on top of that building and look inside, I think that's a very I think that's a great feature of that part of the German parliament.
I mean, it could be super interesting to think about ways to organize a parliament like horizontally across a landscape, for example. I mean, literally across the landscape, but also in terms of the architectural type being a kind of built landscape, so to speak. I think, I mean, I didn't know, for example, about this kind of neutral aspect that you just mentioned. But I mean, I'm sure there's like lots of also hardcore pragmatics in terms of security and whatnot. But yeah, I think it could really be interesting to question those aspects, because it's, I mean, it has been like this for a long time now, and I think there's definitely some interesting approaches that could be mobilized.
I mean, more on more abstract level, maybe actually there was supposed to be an edition of the Art of Assembly, which didn't happen for known reasons, some months ago, which was the idea to talk about the parliament of things, or parliament of humans and non-humans, a bit drawing from Latour, and where Frédéric Aituati was supposed to come, a theater director that Latour works with. She was talking, unfortunately not in the series yet, but maybe one day, about the difficulties even as an experiment, because they had so many protocols, how to include the idea, how to represent a river, how to present other entities that could not voice, and the whole debate about it was in a way, she was in a very, I think in a very productive way. Even in this experiment it was a complete failure, but maybe it can be only, but so maybe we would need a parallel parliament that develops these kind of new procedures or softwares and so on, and that can fail permanently while the other permanent is still dealing whatever with the things that has to be dealt with. And that brings maybe back again this idea of temporality or change, possibility to change, because it can only be, how could it be with trial and error, and that on the other hand is of course not necessarily what we want to see in our representation. So this, I guess, is one of the main contradictions. Is there another comment or question?
I was just wondering, the room you designed and explained earlier for different politicians, how it turned out, because I think you weren't explaining earlier. I don't remember the building, but you've been talking about this building that you designed in Bristol, or where I don't remember where it was.
Yeah, the space, I mean, the building is an existing building in Brussels, the Justus Lipsius building, yeah, and we designed the space there.
Yeah, so I was just wondering if there was any like change that was significant, because like you said earlier, the room was designed different, and then you came up with this new concept of room. And was there an effect afterwards, like when you talking to some people, or like how the politicians been talking to each other?
Yeah, well, I know. I mean, I spoke to politicians afterwards that used it, and at first they were all very uncomfortable with it, because let's say it was breaking away, sort of, let's say, from the standard way of having this kind of meetings. But then, at least I was told that they also kind of liked it because it allowed, on a kind of pragmatic level, for literally different kind of settings. But it became also a space in which they, because of this kind of, let's say, instability or uncomfortableness, they sort of, let's say, also connected in a kind of a different way and had a different type of conversation. So it was, in that sense, also an experiment to, let's say, break the protocol a little bit. Let's say, on a kind of anecdotal level, is that, for example, when we delivered the space, there was a huge controversy about the fact that, everything was kind of soft. So it was not possible to put flowers in. And it was not in my brief that I needed to create something to put a pot with flowers, but it was not possible. And our client was the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so obviously the Dutch embassy in Brussels was heavily involved. And then afterwards they let me read this conversation, and there were literally weeks of exchanging that there should come a solution where they could put the flowers, because there is someone in charge of the protocol that basically receives fresh flowers for this space every week that she didn't know where to put it, So it's
maybe
also
that's actually
that
a nice moment that the flowers, because you also put the flags out of the room, that there were more discussions about the flowers than the flags. Maybe that's a hopeful notion for the European Parliament.
No tulips, no flowers.
There was a question in the middle.
Maybe just to quickly add something. I mean, I think it's super interesting design. I think, especially what I really like is the fact that it ventures from one space into the next, and it also creates a kind of like a breakout room in a way, or a waiting room, but this kind of, let's say, unstable condition. I was wondering, so you said I think it's like 28 modules, no? Yeah. And can you also, I don't know, take them out and slightly rearrange them?
No,
or?
you cannot rearrange them, but you can use them individually. Oh. So what we did is that afterwards they were also sent to European capitals. So, and then each piece becomes kind of, let's say, almost this kind of weird-looking thing that you can use as furniture. Yeah. And then they together form that thing. But actually it would have been also nice, indeed, if you can rearrange. We did a project that I didn't show tonight, which was for an art center, in which we were invited to do a kind of a forum. And then we made 64 blocks that from 3 different heights, and that you could rearrange. So we made 4 different settings, and then we also taped the settings on the floor in different colors, like a sports court. And then indeed, as an audience, you could decide, for example, if you were here, maybe the first part of the evening would be kind of a lecture setting, but there was also kind of, let's say, conversation setting, like a kind of a spiral. So you sit in a spiral, but there were also, let's say, the benches to do this kind of crossing benches, kind of, let's say, more debating setting. And I really like these kind of spaces that somehow invite you to think a little bit about the space you want to use. Yeah.
Questions addressing both presentations. First of all, regarding the Diavania, right pronounced, in Kuwait, this is a kind, you also mentioned the relation to a pub or something like that. Is there a kind of formal power to this Diavania, or how you also mentioned that some decisions there would be prepared and then transferred to a higher level, but and it's operated by families, so it's a question, have I access, who have access to the system, and who is allowed to take part? This is one I would ask and address the question to you. And to you, the other question, do you find out a relation between this kind of floor plan or shape of the parliaments to the kind of the election majority system or proportional system? Is there a relation? Thank you.
Should I do the last one first. Yeah, it's a simple one. What we showed in the book is that, of course, there are. So we use this kind of, let's say, democracy index, which is something that the economists came up with. There are many problems with it. Obviously, it's a kind of a very particular agenda that is, let's say, defines the parameters for this index. So, but with this disclaimer, at the same time, it's also more or less the only kind of accepted standard, that kind of scores all countries on a kind of the level of democracy. And we also scored these different parliaments, or we showed, let's say, the position of the country of which we show the parliament on this index. And then you can see that democratic countries tend to have this kind of circular or semicircular setting, and that, generally speaking, this classroom is for non-democratic or authoritarian regimes. So there, in that sense, that is a kind of a very clear relation. At the same time, obviously, there is a kind of like a wide range in between, in which this relationship is not so evident, particularly because I think, as we're also exploring this conversation, there's always a, connection between hardware and software, and that is not always so evident in the design of these parliaments. But in general, I would say that this kind of classrooms, you don't see them in countries that have a very high score on the democracy index.
Okay, so to answer your question regarding Diwania, it's basically a participation by choice. So the spaces that I've shown, they're localized spaces. They are, yes, privately owned or privately set up. And the people who participate in those spaces are usually locals, but also sometimes people from other areas in the city, because the programming of these spaces is not always super informal in the sense that you just go there to have a coffee and have an informal chat, but sometimes they also have specific items that they discuss. So let's say if we would transfer the system to Munich, and let's say, I don't know, you would live in Schwabing and there would be a local Diwania near your house, maybe one of the issues that would be discussed would be, I don't know, the bike lanes in Schwabing. So if this would be the case, then there's always a connection to formal politics in the sense that from the national parliament, which of course in the case of Kuwait it's let's say it's a city parliament because it's a city-state, but representatives from this parliament basically go into different districts to basically receive information from these different, it's kind of like a satellite system, you could say, but it's very informal. But so for me what's interesting is that the informal informs the formal. Yeah.
There's not is there another urgent comment or question? Otherwise, maybe we would come closely to an end with this question, with the problem we will not solve tonight. So I think it's also interesting where when we talk about concrete parliaments, which was a bit limiting tonight, but I think that was the idea, because I think it also shows like why we hit the wall certain there, and some are obvious and some are not. So I think that was quite interesting, and of course leads to other questions that we addressed in many other ways, like the question of consensus and agonistic systems that you also showed in there, and that you're also dealing with as a question within your research. We talked a lot about and how this is being shaped or not. So I thought, like, with these different rooms, we could maybe, now we send everybody to the consensus room, and now everybody goes to the confrontation room, which in a way is, I guess, also happening with the staging in the parliament, where the confrontation is supposed to be take place, and sometimes it's a bit constructed, and then you have the consensus outside. So I think a lot of these questions are mirrored in this debate. And I would, if you're interested, next week we are the Art of Assembly will already take place next week again due to some mix-up in the schedule due to COVID, and that will be in New York, where we'll dive a little bit more into the question of theater again, the question of audience, also something, well, we have to relearn maybe in a certain degree after these 2 years. So what does audience participation mean? Which I find quite interesting, because I think there's also a nightmare of participation, obviously, in audience participation sometimes, as it's just often a fake participation, but then there's also some necessary confrontation. And there will be, as a guest, Claire Bishop, who wrote, I guess, the most influential book on participation in recent years, Artificial Health, the artisan activist Tanya Bruguera, and the theater and performance maker Anne Liv Young. So to listen in will be a bit challenge in time, because it happens at 7 in the evening, so at 1 here. So, but it will be online for a while, so you can listen later. And otherwise, it would be nice to see you in some other edition again. And I think with this, we close, and as always, continue the discussion outside, which is also more difficult in these times, or in the canteen. Thanks a lot for coming, and thanks a lot for being here, and see you again.